The laws for society, the 10 words, the laws of cleanliness, the 10 words of the Torah. It's important to note this. And then we have the verbal Torah, which is the Mishnah and the Talmud. It's not written yet. It was written about 100 AD. So this is basically what we're looking at from the standpoint. And we can never forget, everybody knows the Torah in this culture. Remember, I've told you before, well, I got a little bit of time. Remember, every little boy at 5 years old is taught to memorize the Torah. And they're supposed to have it memorized by 12. Then after 12, if they become a rabbinic scholar under the training of a rabbi, then they'll memorize the other scrolls. And the other scrolls includes at this time what? The apocryphal documents, because they're part of the Septuagint. The Septuagint being the Greek version. Now, they didn't memorize the Greek version. What version did they memorize? The Hebrew and Aramaic, because remember, a lot is Hebrew and Aramaic, but guess what they popularly read? The Greek. The Greek was popularly read. Okay, let's see.
Is Aramaic the same as Syriac?
Very similar. It's very close to Arabic.
Okay.
Matter of fact, one of the big things was when the Masoretic texts were written with the pointlets, when they added the pointlets around 800 AD or so, they actually were using the sounds from Arabic, because both Aramaic had not totally gone out, but they didn't know what the sounds were in Hebrew. That's why today we don't know how to pronounce Yahweh, or J-H, J whatever. No one knows how to pronounce that word, because the vowel sounds were never pronounced by the priest, except one time. That's at the Rosh Hashanah, when he recited the last part of the 118th Psalm. And I think we'll talk about that we'll get to that at some point when we talk about the Gospels. But since it was never recited except by the high priest, no one knew how to say the name of God. And as a matter of fact, the vowel sounds had gone out because since they're not written, right, in written Hebrew in the Torah scrolls, there's no way to know what the vowels were correctly. So, in the Masoretics, when they re-added them back in at 800 AD, they used the Arabic vowel sounds. So it's an interesting question.
The previous slide you said 10 words. I don't know.
Sorry, I should explain that. When you see the 10 words, that's what the translation of the Hebrew is for the 10 Commandments. We call them 10 Commandments, but literally in the Hebrew it's the 10 Amar, the 10 command words of God, which is really the synopsis. In other words, it stands in place. Whenever you see anywhere when a Hebrew person talks about 10 words, that means that's the synopsis of the law and means the whole law. As a matter of fact, where did we first begin to see the tablets written with 10 on them? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Any idea?
In the movie?
Well, in the Renaissance, they began putting them into the stonework, into the cathedrals. And later, the synagogues started doing the same thing. So it's not a Hebrew thing, it's more of a Christian thing that the Hebrew synagogues began to copy. So they never ever had that, because they always had the Torah scroll, where we would picture it, where the Christians would picture it as 2 tablets like that. They didn't really picture it quite the same way. And plus, they pictured it as full of text, right? Where we would picture it as commandments. So, kind of interesting. Everything has a historical reason. Everything has a historical antecedent. Everything has something you can trace it back to. And that's what's so neat about history. It's very important to note, in Numbers 15, 30 through 31, if anyone sins defiantly, whether native born or alien, blasphemes the Lord, and that person must be cut off from his people. If a person does anything defiantly, whether he's native or alien, that person is blaspheming the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from among his people. Now, what does that mean, to defiantly sin?
Does it mean knowingly?
Yeah, knowingly and intentionally. Now, wait a second, you're going to tell me, wasn't the sin and guilt sacrifice supposed to take care of that?
We assume that.
No, it's not. Matter of fact, the rabbis will tell you, go talk to your rabbi. You look at the JPS handbook, and if you look at the rabbinical understanding of the Talmud, there was no sacrifice for intentional sins. There's no sacrifice available for intentional sins. As a matter of fact, If you look at the JPS handbook, there are 31 unforgivable sins. And guess what? 10 of them are the Big 10, right? And there are many others listed. One of them is if you don't go to the, there's the 6 festivals every year. If you don't go to the 3 pilgrim festivals where you're supposed to go to Jerusalem, that's an unforgivable sin. If you don't hear the sound of the shofar at Rosh Hashanah, that is an unforgivable sin. If you don't fast during, if you have leaven at Passover, it's unforgivable. You cannot, there's no sacrifice for those intentional sins, those sins. Right? There's no sacrifice if you do it unintentionally. See? The point is this. I'm trying to set you up for why was it so important for the Jews at the time to accept the gospel? Why was the gospel message such a big deal to the Jewish people? Because they had 31 things that were unforgivable. And most of them were living where? In the diaspora. They're living away from Jerusalem. Even Paul, remember Paul of Tarsus? He's from Tarsus, which is, when I showed you the Levant, that's up in Turkey, a little bit in Turkey on the coast. So already they are looking for a Messiah, as we discussed during the Apocryphal period, which we'll talk more about. But they have an issue because there is no sacrifice for intentional sin. Of course, this was exacerbated because when the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, and then when they were made a non-legio regitis, a legitimate religion, in 125 AD, what happened? You can't sacrifice anyway in 70 AD, right? So it became even worse. So you've got to realize that there is a groundwork, a framework. I don't like to talk about theology or doctrine, but your homework is think about this within that context, right? Why would all this undergirding be already ready? And we haven't talked about Mysterion yet. And I'm going to talk about that.
What is JPS?
Jewish Publication Society Handbook.
Okay.
The JPS handbook is the handbook that the Jewish people in English use. Almost every Jewish home that's Orthodox Jewish home will have a JPS handbook because it lists all the festivals, it lists what they do, it lists all the traditions, Jewish basic traditions, and a lot of their belief structure. It's a really neat document. But all this points directly to this messianic idea. Because if there's no sacrifice, redemption for intentional sin, you got a serious problem, right? Because guess what? We know all sin is, whether we want to equivocate or not, we know most sin is intentional, right? Yeah. Okay. So anyway, that's what this is all saying. The synagogue in the New Testament period had a legal as well as religious function. It wasn't just, remember, where did you worship in this period if you're a Jew? No.
In the temple.
In the temple. The temple's for worship. The synagogue is for learning. That's where you went to learning. This is where the legal issues were handled, at the synagogue. The synagogue later, and in basically the diaspora periods, the synagogue became a center for worship. Because why?
No temple.
They had no temple, and in the diaspora, they had no availability of a temple. So it's very interesting because this is a change in Jewish thought. And you know when it's happening, right? Just before the Apocryphal period and the first diasporas, the Assyrian and the Babylonian diaspora, and then it's happening, well, it actually happened with the split of Israel and Judah to begin with, right? That's when I'm an early date synagogue thinker. Okay, so I think the synagogue started first with the split of Israel and Judah. But we know they became in vogue or became in fashion or invented in the Babylonian exile. And then we know that they were there in the Apocryphal period, and we know they were definitely there in the New Testament period, you see. So you've seen this change in Jewish thought from the focus totally on the temple to a focus on the synagogue, which, by the way, today, where's the focus? On the synagogue. Completely on the synagogue, because the temple's destroyed. So, this is all about that, the training, the verbal mission, etc., etc. And remember, who owned the synagogues? Pharisees.
Oh.
Pharisees owned the synagogues. We'll talk about this. Now, history is critical. Let's talk about this history of the world. We're already, okay, remember, this was a very short paraphrase of what I tried to tell you last week that I told you we didn't have time to get into because I got too excited about telling you about some of the basic cultural stuff. But I'm trying to give you a focus in a real short period, so we're really hitting on this. History is critical. We're talking about 4 BC to 0 AD, you know, as we go into the Gospels. Because when we get into the Gospel period, we'll talk a little bit more about later than that. But in any case, the city-state, each with its own political system. We talked about Athens, the only democracy until, actually, the only democracy ever, really. The Romans had a republic. And we'll talk about that. They were in constant war with each other without outside enemies, but the Greeks were not generally defeated or subjugated until the Romans. The most important invention in this time, 400 to 0 AD, is Greek philosophy. Now, the Greeks did not see their philosophy as separate from theology, but it is a direct separation from paganism. I'm going to talk about paganism because it's really important to understand what paganism is. It was a direct separation from the world's past way of thinking. We're going to see how that is. A key date is 399 BC because that's the death of Socrates. Now, the death of Socrates does not mean the invention of philosophy or anything like that, but the death of Socrates is key in the thinking of Western civilization because we see that as a keynote date of when we say this is really when philosophy or Greek rationalism began. And Greek rationalism is the focus of the world, especially in Western civilization, up through the Gospel period. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I'll argue when we get into the Gospels is Jesus Christ was trying to show a Greek rational worldview as opposed to the Hebrew D-rash thinking worldview. And I'll tell you what D-rash thinking is in a second. In any case, how did we get to this? How do we get to this philosophy, this Greek rational thought? Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great. In 336 BC, he took the kingship of Macedonia. Here's Macedonia. You saw it in my picture before, Hellas. In 323, he dies in Babylon of illness. But in between those short years, he conquered the known world. Okay? This is critical to understand. If you don't understand this, you can't even begin to understand what's going on in the Gospel period. Because Alexander the Great conquered the world. And if you notice this picture, this shows his the way he conquered, and here we go. This is into India even. Persia, India, Egypt. Egypt was Greek from this period. Persia was Greek from this period. Turkey was Greek from this period. Okay? It's really important. Cleopatra is Greek. All the Cleopatras were Greek. In this time, okay, if you got a guy who comes and conquers the world, okay, in a pagan worldview, we'll talk more about pagan worldview, but just try to imagine a pagan worldview, what does that mean?
Change to do things his way.
Well, yeah, because why?
He's in charge.
Well, the gods love him, right? If you're a pagan worldview, okay, and I'll give you a precursor, okay? In a pagan worldview, you believe that the world is basically controlled by the gods. The physical things that happen in the world are due to faith in gods. So rivers flow because of spirits. Animals live and thrive because of spirits. Trees grow because of spirits. That is a pagan worldview. So in a pagan worldview, what's moving the world? The gods and spirits, and also fate. We'll talk more about fate. But in any case, if a guy beats you and wins, what does that mean you want to do? Well, worship his gods, right? Because obviously he's got the gods on his side. Otherwise he would see. This is really a different way of thinking for us, right? Because why do things fall to the ground? It's gravity, right? Can you make a fire? It's because of phosphorus and the friction, right? But if you think that there's a God in that match, see, if you think there's a God in that fire, then what caused that to happen?
The God.
The God. See? And so therefore, what caused Alexander to beat you?
His
Gods. So therefore, you want to be like him.